Hare Krishna, everyone. Welcome to this week's edition of the Hare Krishnas in Britain podcast. This is episode number 25. We've managed to get to the 25th episode, and I'm really grateful to everyone who's been tuning in each week or each month since the beginning of the year, actually, to listen to these podcasts. We've had a huge selection of guests from mainly from the UK, but we've had some guests from other countries as well. So you could say to some extent that we're international. And it's been really good to firstly meet devotees from around the country and find out what they're doing, and also discuss some really, really interesting topics, topics that I'm interested in, and I hope that others are interested in as well. Hopefully many of you saw either on Facebook or YouTube a couple of weeks ago our most recent episode. We put together an episode about Swami Sadananda Das. Swami Sadananda Das was one of those well-known converts from the 1930s who went on to eventually become an initiating guru in Europe. He attracted a very small but loyal following. And those of you, always plug for my book, those of you that have read my book will have read about different personalities and kind of the recent history of Gaudiya Vaishnavism over the last 100 years. And some of you may have read about or learned about Sri Krishna Prem, also known as Ronald Nixon. And I'm super delighted, therefore, to share with you that Sri Krishna Prem is our topic of discussion on this week's podcast. And to help us kind of find out more about Sri Krishna Prem, I'd love to welcome Jon Chapple as our guest this week. Nice to see you, Jon.
Nice to see you. Thanks for having me on. Hare Krishna, everyone.
It's great to see you. Jon is from all the way in East London. From Barking, beautiful part of the world. I worked in Barking once. I used to go there once a month and stayed for a few hours each time.
Lucky you.
Yeah. So I tell you all the story, actually. I was sharing on social media our recent podcast about Swami Sadananda Das, and Jon saw the post, and got in touch, and we've been liaising with each other for a few weeks. And Jon is writing a book about Sri Krishna Prem. So in a minute, we're going to talk a bit about Sri Krishna Prem, because I have some questions as well for Jon. But Jon, firstly, just tell us a bit about yourself. I mean, we know you're embarking, kind of where are you from originally, and what's your background? What do you do?
So I'm from Essex, which I think Barking was historically, but I mean, like proper Essex, out in the countryside a little bit more. So I was a journalist for 10 years. I've recently just started a new job in PR, but I still sort of consider myself a journalist really, and a writer. So yeah, that's me really. First became interested in Gaudiya Vaishnavism probably when I was at university. I think similar route to you, indirectly via George Harrison and all that wonderful music, and sort out the devotees, and used to go to the manor quite a lot when I was at university. They used to do like uni weekends there and stuff. And then just kept up an interest in a very loose association since then. It's sort of I hesitate to call myself a devotee because I think that implies a lot of disciplines and responsibilities and stuff that I haven't that I don't personally I'm not following at the moment. But so I think I said to you, I consider myself more of a well-wisher than a devotee, but certainly very, very interested and sympathetic.
I think that the Hare Krishna movement needs a lot of well-wishers and a lot of well-wishes. It needs a lot of people to wish us well in our efforts to spread Krishna consciousness with the general public. So you've kind of been around, or you've had links with the Hare Krishna movement for 10 years, maybe
13.
I mean, I'm not quite sure how old you are. It's often rude to ask how old people are.
Yeah. It's good that you guessed slightly under rather than slightly over. If you'd have said 20 something.
25.
Exactly. 13, I think it makes it.
Okay. So what I think is really good is that you've still kind of held on to this interest in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, this kind of interest in a movement that has its roots in India, but has spread all over the world. And, you know, we're finding out more and more about the movement and the history of the movement and how it's spread through different personalities. Now it's completely, everyone agrees, I hope, that the most, you know, the strongest or the most active proponent of Krishna consciousness in our era was A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. What he did in the 60s and 70s was just phenomenal, you know, with, you know, putting his faith in Krishna and traveling all over the world and doing all those wonderful things is kind of second to none. But what we're also learning about now are other personalities of different heritages that have, you know, inspired people. When I embarked myself on kind of this journey of writing a book about Gaudiya Vaishnavism, one of the personalities that I discovered through that was Ronald Nixon, or Sri Krishna Prem. And I think, I'm gonna say pleased to hear about him. That sounds a bit patronizing, but I was really kind of chuffed to discover his existence. Like here you have a man, an Englishman in the 1920s who kind of, I guess, developed an interest in Indian spirituality and went to India. I mean, that's the short story. And as a guy from the West Country, sometimes my accent comes through. You know, he's someone from the same part of the world as I am. And this year, 2021, is the 100th anniversary of Ronald Nixon, or Sri Krishna Prem, going to India. So, John, tell us, for any of our listeners who have never heard of Sri Krishna Prem, tell us a bit about him, kind of where he's from, his background, all those types of things.
Yeah, so as you say, he was born in 1898, the tail end of the Victorian era, in Cheltenham, in where is that, Gloucestershire?
Yeah, Gloucestershire. Yeah, the West Country.
Yeah, exactly. And grew up in a fairly ordinary upper middle class family. You know, comfortable but not rich. His mum, I believe, was a Christian Scientist, which is a sort of certain esoteric form of Christianity, which also deals with faith healing and all that sort of stuff. So it's but other than that, he didn't grow up in a particularly religious family, but developed an interest as a young man in first Buddhism and Theosophy, which was very popular at the time as a way of bringing the Eastern religions to the West. And then later Vaishnavism. So he was mostly interested in Buddhism to start with. World War I interrupted his studies before he went to Cambridge. He went to Cambridge. But
he was a pilot in World War I think.
He was a pilot, yeah. So before he could go to Cambridge, he joined what was the forerunner to the RAF, which was called the RFC. So he was, you know, imagine the planes that they had in World War I, those old wooden biplanes covered in canvas, you know, very, very dangerous. And in the war, he had a certain mystical experience, which later became legend in India in his lifetime, and also sort of via a process of Chinese whispers also got massively exaggerated, and everyone had their own version of the story. But the basic truth of it was he was out on a sortie, on a mission one night, came across a load of enemy planes. Basically, he was being chased by these enemy planes. There was a problem with his plane. They were extremely unreliable aircraft at the time. He tried to turn left in his plane, but felt the controls, he said, being wrenched out of his hands and being moved to the right instead. And if he had have gone to the left, that was where he would have died. Basically, the plane would have gone to bits and they'd have gone down.
Yeah.
So that part of it has been mythologized over the years. I think, like, you read in some sources, some people say he saw a blue hand, you know, reach into his cockpit, and, you know, he heard the name Krishna on the wind and all this sort of stuff. But that's the basic truth of what he said. He had this experience after the war, went to India, basically decided that he needed to go to India. He had this interest in the Buddha, had this interest in theosophy. Originally attracted to, I suppose, what you'd call Advaita Vedanta, or what some people in ISKCON would call Mayavadi philosophy. But felt this calling to go to India, basically managed to secure himself, went to Cambridge first, and then after Cambridge managed to secure himself a job as an English professor in Lucknow.
Wow.
So that was how he ended up in India. And then briefly, he got to India. The vice chancellor of Lucknow University, his wife was a woman called Monica Chakravarti. He was called Dr. Jayendranath Chakravarti, and she became his guru. She had this one side as a very fashionable, beautiful society woman, sort of grand dame of Lucknow, if you like, hosted all these fashionable parties. Everyone knew her. They were sort of, upper class, educated, westernized Bengalis, Brahmins. But he saw that she had this other side. She'd sort of go off and, even during one of these big parties, she'd go off and he'd see she'd disappear for like half an hour at a time, and she'd come back completely renewed. And he'd wonder, saw that there was this hidden side to her. And eventually she opened up to him, said she was going off and meditating, and that she was meditating on Krishna, and eventually he persuaded her to give him initiation, and that's how he was that's how he came to be a Vaishnava. And sorry, so he became her disciple. Later on, decided that he wanted some official connection. Quite happy with, very happy with her as a guru, and completely loyal to her his whole life, her whole life, and even after she passed away. But decided he wanted some connection with Gaudiya Vaishnavism officially. So they went to Vrindavan. They supposedly lived in Vrindavan for a couple of weeks, stayed on one of the bathing ghats, just camped out for weeks, and news traveled that there was this white man, this Westerner in town that wanted a guru. And eventually he didn't take initiation because he'd already been initiated by her. So he couldn't, as a matter of etiquette, he couldn't be reinitiated, but they arranged for her to take initiation from a chap called Sri Krishna Goswami of the Radha Raman temple in Vrindavan. So Krishna became his Param Guru. So that's how he became initiated officially into the Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya, and that was the 1920s.
And that's 100 years later, I would still consider that quite radical. So this is I to remind myself, because I've read so many books over the last 2 years, where I heard about Sri Krishna Prem first. It was in this book. So Vaishnavi Women in the Worship of Krishna.
Okay. Yeah.
By Stephen Rosen or Satyaraj Das, a disciple of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. So this is a book about women and Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And then I think it wasn't by chance, if I'm honest, somebody told me about the contents. And then I discovered through this book, Ronald Nixon, Sri Krishna Prem. And I think it was in the context of a conversation I was having with a devotee, is how 100 years later, ISKCON is still struggling. I mean, using ISKCON as one example, there's lots of different mats, but ISKCON is the biggest and the most well known. ISKCON is still struggling with this reality of women being gurus or Vaishnavi gurus. So the fact that 100 years before now, there was at least one Gaudiya Vaishnava female guru. I mean, there were others as well. I find it quite inspiring and enlightening, I guess. And she initiated a white man from England.
I mean, it caused a sensation. And there's a book called The Hare Krishnas in India by a guy called Charles Brooks, which came out at some time in the 80s, and he sort of talks about this. It's worth reading. They found Krishna Goswami, who initiated them, and sort of indirectly initiated Krishna Prem, but he was excommunicated for doing so. He was sort of shunned from the the Radha Raman Goswamis and the Goswamis of Vrindavan, and Krishna Prem wasn't allowed in the temples and all this sort of stuff. It caused a huge controversy, and eventually there was a meeting of all the Goswamis of Vrindavan all met together and decided, what are we going to do about this thing? And eventually, on the principles of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, didn't care about caste and initiated Muslims, and obviously, the story. And it was decided that following Mahaprabhu's example, Krishna Prem was following the rules that Yashoda Mai, his guru. Sorry, I should mention his guru is called Yashoda Mai. That's Mrs. Chakravarti. Had put down. He was following all of the ritual purity rules of a Brahmin. I mean, he was following all of the instructions. So they said, let him in, and that obviously paved the way for Prabhupada, 40 years later, to be able to bring loads of work, and Bhaktivedanta Saraswati to bring Sadhananda Das, and it sort of paved the way for people to be able to bring all these white devotees to Vrindavan, and for them to be, relatively accepted.
Do you know if Sri Krishna Prem, so after he went to India, he was initiated, do you know if he still kept in contact with his family in England, or if he or did he go back to England to visit at all?
He never went back, no. They were quite, especially Madhava Ashish, his successor guru, at Matola, the ashram they founded, but I think Krishna Prem as well, they sort of they emphasize leaving, as sannyasis, leaving those sort of things behind, and you shouldn't really have too much contact. I know he met his sister, who was called Barbara Nixon. He met her in Lucknow in 1948, I believe, after 20 years, because she was in the area. But other than that, not really. I think he wrote to a niece as well, I believe. I think if people wrote to him and people said, we want to see you, they could go to him, or they could make contact with him. But no, he never went home.
So he was 1898, 19. So he was 23 when he went to India, I think.
Yeah,
my massive terrible. His parents do you know much about his parents? Were they still around? Were they supportive?
They were still around. It's not really documented how supportive they were, but his dad certainly, when he was younger, supported his interest in all things Indian. Supposedly bought him, Buddhist paraphernalia and all this sort of stuff. So they encouraged his interest in theosophy and Buddhism and Indian religions when he was younger. But obviously being a sannyasi, or a vairagi, they called it, which is another type of Vaishnava ascetic. Being a vairagi, you weren't really supposed to talk about your past. I mean, Ronald Nixon was dead, and Krishna Prem was him now. So it's not really talked about too much.
I guess the Christians would call it born again.
You're
born again. Yeah. You're a brand new person, whatever that means.
There's a famous story of him supposedly being asked in India, what happened to Professor Nixon, and he says, oh he's dead now.
Wow. I mean, for me, on the kind of historical scene, he's so significant because we believe he was the first Western convert to Gaudiya Vaishnavism. I mean, I'm not aware of any others, unless.
See, this is again from your book and your research that I first came across these people, but I think the disciples of Premananda Bharati in America probably were, if you were going to give it to anyone and say they were absolutely the first, because he was in America.
He was 1902. He went to America. I mean, there's not much.
There's not much detail.
Evidence.
He claimed to have 500 Americans at one point, didn't he? Which I think was probably an exaggeration, but he certainly made some followers.
And outside a few select sources of information, there's little information about him and what he did. I mean, I'd also like to think possibly, and we've gone off a bit of a tangent here, I'd like to think, not like to think, it's not the right expression, but the fact that, we've got the British Raj, the British Empire, so to speak. There were a lot of English people in the, serving for Queen and country or king and country, going to India to serve. And I'd like to think maybe they experienced Gaudiya Vaishnavism, particularly in Bengal. They were in, Calcutta was the capital of the British of India at the time under the British.
Yeah.
And so, there were a number of Gaudiya Vaishnav gurus there. And there might have been others that we're not aware of.
I think he was certainly the first Western Gaudiya Vaishnava guru. I think he was certainly unless there were some disciples of Baba Bharati that we don't know about that did make disciples. I think he's certainly the only one we have record of, the first white man to initiate people into Gaudiya Vaishnavism and to initiate Indians as well. He definitely and Englishmen. I mean, he had English disciples, he had Indian disciples. He was and recognized as being a guru, as a sadhu by the locals, and also in Vrindavan, like we talked about. So
I guess kind of geographically and kind of in terms of a timeline here, he spent, him and Ma Yashoda spent some time in Vrindavan. And then they went up to the Himalayas after that.
So he taught in Lucknow, and the Chakravartis, Yashoda Mai, lived in Lucknow. And then he accepted a different job because his guru's husband, Dr. Chakravarti, accepted a job at Banaras Hindu University in Banaras, which is now Varanasi. He accepted a job at the university there, so he could be near them. Then after that, they went up to the Himalayas. They went to, there's a town called Almora, which is in Uttarakhand. Is that how you pronounce it? I think it is. It's the very northern, one of the very northern states above Uttar Pradesh, in the Himalayas. So they both, him and Yashoda Mai, went up there. Eventually they founded, and they looked where they could find an ashram around there. Eventually settled on a village called Metola, and that's where the ashram was. And the ashram it started out being called Uttara Vrindavan of the North, but it was usually called Metola after the village where they were. So I believe they founded they went up to Almora in 1928, I believe, and then 1930, I think, they officially had the ceremony for the temple, the opening of it.
So before we talk a bit in depth about that ashram and the temple they set up, I just got one question, because I'm trying to kind of fit things together in my head chronologically, and this is where this question fits in.
Okay.
Did Sri Krishna Prem meet Bhaktivedanta Saraswati Thakur?
I don't believe so.
And or were they aware of each other's existence?
I don't believe so. Srila Prabhupada was aware of Professor Nixon, Krishna Prem's existence, but I don't think Bhaktivedanta Saraswati Thakur was aware of him. And Krishna Prem certainly never referred to the Gaudiya Math, and never referred to Bhaktivedanta Saraswati. So I don't think they were aware of each other. He must have. I say that they weren't aware of each other. They never wrote it down. I mean, Krishna Prem must have been aware of the Gaudiya Math, because he made regular visits to Calcutta, made regular visits to Vrindavan, made regular visits to. I presume there's a Gaudiya Math in Varanasi. There must be. So
yeah, I mean, at its peak, when Bhaktivedanta Prabhupada passed away in 1937, he left 64 mats in operation. So there were 64 temples, Gaudiya Mat temples. And I have to confess, I don't know the list of where they all were or are, but one of them probably definitely New Delhi, Calcutta, Vrindavan. And most of them were established by the late 1920s, early 1930s.
I think. Yeah, he visited all of these cities in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, so he must have been aware of the Gaudiya Math, but never wrote anything down about it. But our Prabhupada, Bhaktivedanta Swami, was certainly aware of Krishna Prem. There's, if you look in the Bhaktivedanta database and search for Nixon, there's a few references. Unfortunately, there's one where he's just about to talk about Professor Nixon in more detail, and someone interrupts him. It's just a transcript of a conversation, and somebody interrupts him with something else, and the sentence stops dead, and you're like, no. But there is a book. There is a book written by someone whose name I forget. It's an Indian sannyasi disciple of Bhaktivedanta Swami, Srila Prabhupada, and he recalls giving Prabhupada the book Yogi Sri Krishna Prem, which is the closest there is to a biography that's out there already. It was written by his friend Dilip Kumar Roy. It's mostly letters. The biographical portion of it is like that, but it's mainly just stories that Dilip remembers about being with Krishna Prem. But he mentions that he gave that book to Prabhupada, and Prabhupada read it and said that Krishna Prem was a great inspiration. And he gets his name wrong, actually. He calls him Krishna Premi, which means something slightly different, doesn't it? I think Krishna Prem is Krishna's Prem, whereas I think Krishna Premi is a lover of Krishna, is it? So he says he was one Krishna Premi, and now we're making lots of Krishna Premis, So I thought that there's quite a nice sentiment.
So when you say that Srila Prabhupada was aware of Sri Krishna Prem's existence, was this pre-65 in this 30s or? Okay. This is after
the founding of ISKCON. Well, after he'd come to the West. So yeah, he'd been given this copy of this book, I think, which is how he became aware of him. But I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if he'd heard about him before in the 50s or whenever before he came to the West. But yeah, he'd certainly heard about him by the time ISKCON was a thing.
So, John, you're writing a book. Is it a biography?
Yeah, it's I mean, I haven't written the book before, so it's quite daunting. It's I've written lots of articles, and I've spoken to a few people in my research, and some of them have been journalists too, and they said just think of it as a big article. Like, just keep adding to it every now and then. It's no different to an article. It's just a really big article. So yeah, but it's a book. It's going to be a book at some point, hopefully. Yeah,
I mean, for me, just a bit of advice. When I was writing my book, literally in practice and in my head, I dealt with a chapter at a time, and then when the chapter was complete, I kind of put it to bed to some extent. I had to go back and redo things, but yeah, I just saw myself as writing 6 or 7 chapters over 6 months or a year, and that helped me psychologically with the reality that I'm writing a book.
Right. Interesting. See, I'm doing basically the exact opposite. I just keep it's just one disordered all over the place that I just keep. I find I get inspiration about a certain thing. I'll be like, I'll think about a certain quote or read a certain passage about some book, and I'll be like, oh, that inspires me. I'm going to write a little bit about this period of history. So yeah, I'm doing exactly the opposite to you, basically. But yeah, hopefully it works out.
So tell us a bit about now Sri Krishna Prem and Maya Yashoda, their journey, not their journey, but tell us about their time in the Himalayas and what they did, because that was his home, I guess, for over 30 years.
It was his home until he died in 1965. So yeah, 35 years he lived there. It went from being very basic to very slightly less basic by the time he died. It wasn't an easy life. I mean, it's cold up there. It rains and snows a lot. It was an extremely simple ashram with a temple building, a few other cottages. If people wanted to live there, they'd build their own cottage. Basically, they had quite a lot of land, so you could, if you wanted to live there, you could build yourself a little house if you liked. Some beautiful deities. I've heard one's not allowed to take pictures of the deities, and I haven't yet visited, so I haven't seen them. But I believe originally it was just Krishna. It was Krishna in Italian marble, which Yashoda Ma's husband had brought from Italy when he was there on theosophical business. He was quite a prominent theosophist. He spoke at the famous Parliament of Religions where Swami Vivekananda spoke.
1893, was it?
That's the one.
I think
he was
so,
there
yeah.
as part of the theosophical delegation. So he was, quite an important theosophist. So he brought this deity of Krishna back, and it broke. I think it's finger. I'd have to check. Basically, part broke off it, and she took that as meaning that Krishna's missing part of himself, and he needs Radharani there instead. So they got some new deities. So yeah, they didn't have heating apart from the occasional homemade small wood burner which they bring out in the colder months. Didn't have electricity, but I mean, it looks idyllic. It gradually got a little less basic over time. I think they eventually got running water. They eventually got electricity, but I believe after Krishna Prem died, that happened. I think they got electricity in the 70s. So yeah, lots of people passed through, lots of visitors. He didn't make many trips out. He went to, there's one trip which sticks out. He made a big pilgrimage in the late 1940s. In 1948, he went to South India. He first went to Sri Aurobindo's ashram in Pondicherry. His friend Dilip Kumar Roy was a disciple of Sri Aurobindo and lived there, so he went to visit that, and also had darshan of the mother, who was Sri Aurobindo's sort of co-guru there. He later went to, I can never remember to pronounce this, Tiruvannamalai, I think, to Ramana Maharishi, who was a very famous sadhu at that time. He went and had his darshan, and then went further south. He basically did this big trip to South India, but other than that, he spent most of his time in this ashram. Lots of people came through it. Various spiritual seekers. I've got a huge list of people who visited. Some of them have written about it. There's quite a lot of writing by the famous Harvard psychologist turned psychedelic guru Timothy Leary. I don't know if you've heard of.
I've heard of Timothy Leary, but I have to
Leary.
confess I've never really looked into his writings or his teachings.
So he popularized LSD really in the United States during the hippie era. He was like a very, very strong proponent of LSD, but he was supposedly, Krishna Prem was the closest he ever came to taking a guru who called him the wisest man in India, and wrote a lot about that. So yeah, I think a lot of people, they welcomed visitors. He didn't like visitors that would come and just treat him as a plaything, as someone who, he was famous for his kirtans, for his singing, but he didn't like people who just came along and treated him like a performing monkey and was like, I want you to sing because I've heard you sing, I want you to say this, I want you to do this for me. But if someone went and they were a genuine spiritual seeker, they'd be welcomed. There was also a little a sort of basic hut where visiting sadhus could pass through as well, because obviously there's lots of them in that part of the world, so they could stay there for 3 days and they'd be fed, and then they moved on. So and just a bit of wider geography. The Almora, the town, it's about 18 miles from this town called Almora, and Almora had a reputation as well of being somewhere where there's a ridge above Almora, and it became known as Cranks Ridge. Cranks meaning, freaks or weirdos, but used in an affectionate way, because it was full of Western spiritual seekers, full of Germans who'd converted to Buddhism. There was this guy called Shunyata, who was a Danish guy who sort of lived in a cave in silence, and it was like all of these people in Almora on Cranks Ridge. So sort of just outside Mottola as well, there was this community of sort of, I don't know, bohemians and creatives and spiritual seekers and painters and that sort of stuff. So yeah,
sounds a bit like Glastonbury, but in northern India. 100 years ago. That's the only difference.
Basically.
So so Satyaraj, Stephen Rosen, in his book Vaishnavi, Women in the Worship of Krishna, mentions that Sri Krishna Prem did attract a number of English or European disciples or followers. Do
Yeah.
we know about any of them?
We do. There was quite a few. First of all, there was a guy called George Poole, who was a friend of his from Cambridge University, who stayed for a little bit. Yashoda basically told him he wasn't cut out for it and he should go home and get married and go back to England, and he did, and was supposedly very happy. There was a guy called Dr. Alexander, Bob Alexander, who, like Krishna Prem, was a World War One. I don't think he ever actually got to fight, but he was enlisted in World War One. Who Krishna Prem also knew from Cambridge. He turned up at some time in the late. I think he turned up in shortly after they founded it, and he was a doctor in Lucknow, one of the best doctors in India at that point, apparently. And Yashoda Ma said, when will I be ready to drop everything and move here? And she said, in about 10 years. And 10 years later, he did. In 1938, he moved there. He was given sannyas or Vairagi initiation. He took the name Sri Haridas. At Matola, only sannyasis were called Sri. They got the Sri if you're a sannyasi. So you had Sri Yashoda Mai, Sri Krishna Prem, Sri Haridas. After World War II, there was some more people turned up, most notably a guy called Alexander Phipps, who was in the Air Force in World War II. He was an engineer in World War II. He came in 1946, I believe. He was given initiation as, he was initially called Devashish. Then he was given sannyas initiation as Sri Madhava Ashish, and he became Krishna Prem's chosen successor to take over the ashram, so another British guy. There was another chap called Frank Baines, who had also fought in World War II, but doesn't really seem to be cut out for the spiritual life. Madhava Ashish didn't get on with him at all, and seems to think that he basically saw himself as becoming the successor to Krishna Prem, I think, and there was a bit of conflict there. And he left a few years later, but he was given initiation, given the name Govinda Priya. There was another guy called Bill Aiken, who's a famous Scottish travel writer. He lived at Matola from 1965 to 1972, so in the last year of Krishna Prem's life, he took initiation from him and lived there. And more following the death of Krishna Prem, but those are the Westerners I can think of off the top of my head that were there at his time, and then countless other Indians and other Europeans as well.
Well, that's an impressive list, I have to say, and so well done you for reeling those names off. I mean, I have a bit of a kind of a naive question. Is how did these people hear about the ashram? How did they hear about what was happening?
It seems his fame spread because there was this white guru living in the hills in the far Himalayas. I think there was a certain, as I mentioned with the story about the plane, a certain mythology grew around him. And there are all these different stories about World War One. I think the most out there one I've read, which is available online somewhere, I can't remember, Swami something or other has written about it. And it says that he was in World War One, and he was about to land at his base. What he thought was his base, but it was the Germans had actually camouflaged the base and they covered it in stars and stripes. So he thought it was an American base, and he was just about to land there. But then, someone seized the controls and took him away. I mean, that's all completely invented, but this sort of mythology was out there around him. And who is it who mentions? Someone mentions that he heard about. I believe it's a travel writer called Ken Winkler, who's written some good books about some of the personalities on Cranks Ridge. And he says when he came to Almora initially, Krishna Prem was known locally as there were rumors of this this sadhu in the hills that carried an image of Krishna on his head. Krishna Prem, who carried this image of Krishna on his head. And Bill Aiken says he was told about Krishna Prem, and he was told that he was this man living in an ice cave in the Himalayas, and it was just him in this icy cave. So you can see there's sort of this yeah, I think because it was such a novelty, as you say, because he was such a trailblazer, I think it naturally lends itself to these sort of Chinese whispers, and this whole sort of mythology builds around him. But he was certainly locally famous, so I think people just heard about him and went. And also he wrote books, and some people read his books. Frank Baines, the other English serviceman who I mentioned, was given a copy of one of his books in hospital when he was recuperating after having fought in the Burma campaign. He was given a copy of either his book, it was either his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita or his commentary on the Kathopanishad. When he was given that in hospital, and read it
in England.
No, in India.
In India, okay.
Yeah.
And then he had a desire to go and meet Sri Krishna Prem, the author of the book.
He went home and got demobilized, and then came back to India and sought out Sri Krishna Prem. Wow. So, yeah, I'd say books and also just sort of, local fame as well.
So tell us a bit about, Sri Krishna Prem left the world, passed away in I think it was November 1965.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about his successor and what's kind of happened since at the ashram.
So his successor was Alexander Phipps, who I mentioned earlier, Sri Madhava Ashish. He was his successor. He started handing over responsibility for initiations a little while before he died. They basically became extremely close, to the point that by the 1950s, you read accounts and people say it was like one person. It was like they were yin and yang. They were too tall. He was actually Scottish, but everyone calls him English. So I think he spoke with that sort of upper crust English accent. He was sort of educated and spoke in that RP received pronunciation that everyone at the time did. So you had these two tall English sannyasis, and were almost inseparable, like two sides of the same coin. The philosophy evolved. Madhava Ashish was initiated as a Gaudiya Vaishnava, followed all the rules, wore the tilak, wore the tulsi beads initially, but as time went on, as Madhava Ashish put it, Krishna Prem discovered the essential truth beyond the trappings of the thing. He felt like he didn't need the outer symbols. Ashish Da, as he's known, sometimes puts it. He sometimes describes it as the sectarianism of the Vaishnava religion, which I'm not sure that's the right word, but he means the external symbols of belonging to one sampradaya, one path, because Krishna Prem always believed and always wrote about that there are various paths to the same goal, the same as lots of people have, the same as Prabhupada said, we're all worshipping the same God, whether you call him Allah, Jehovah, whatever. It's, there's only one God. And Krishna Prem always believed that there were various paths to the same goal. So after the late 40s into the 50s, he stopped wearing tilak, he stopped wearing neck beads, he stopped wearing dhoti and started wearing sort of like a piece of fabric with a head hole cut in that just sort of hung down, sometimes a little hat, and they simplified the philosophy, made it more universal. I've heard it described in modern day as sort of secular spirituality. So basically that's the way the ashram went. It went away from these external Vaishnava symbols and became influenced by other things. I think Krishna Prem rediscovered his love for theosophy, rediscovered his early love for the Buddha. his last book, which was not completed before he died, which was completed by Madhavashish after he passed, was a commentary on The Secret Doctrine by Madame Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophical Society, which, you know, for a Vaishnava is an extremely unconventional text to be writing a commentary on. So you can see sort of how much he'd shifted and returned to one of his first loves by that time. So that was sort of continued after he died by Madhavashish, and they were also influenced by theosophy. They were very big into dream analysis, Jungian analysis of dreams. So there was lots of dream work. They were influenced by Gurdjieff, the philosophy of the Russian mystic George Gurdjieff. So I think after Krishna Prem died, Madhavashish, the ashram that he took over wasn't recognizably just a Vaishnava ashram by that time. It had its own philosophy, the Murtola philosophy, and he was very he made lots of disciples, Madhavashish, one of which is in charge of the ashram to this day. I think it attracted lots of intellectual, middle upper class Indians. After Krishna Prem died, lots of couples started moving in. There was lots of married couples moved into the cottages and moved into the ashram. Madhavashish died in 1997. His disciple Chitra is in charge of the ashram now. She has some groundskeepers and some help in that sense, but other than that, it's just hers. So I'd say we're on the fourth generation now. Krishna Prem is her Param Guru, and she's Yashoda's great grand disciple. So yeah, it's almost, there's this whole line of which started out as a Gaudiya Vaishnava lineage, which is completely separate to the Gaudiya Math and completely separate to the traditional lines in Vrindavan. So it's a really interesting phenomenon, and there's still a community associated with Matola today, and they have Zoom calls and they chat, and I gather there's WhatsApp groups and everything, and they've been extremely helpful with my research as well, helping me, sending me photos and that sort of stuff, and sending me.
That was going to be a question I had for you, was what have you had contact? How have you been engaging with the ashram with your research?
Yeah, so one of the materials I'm working from is Madhavashish wrote I think intended to write a biography of Krishna Prem. He didn't finish it. It stops about 1950. The raw text is a bit all over the place, but I think Chitra and the Matola community have put it in some sort of logical order. So it reads quite well, but it ends about 1950. But I mean, that's invaluable for someone that knew Krishna Prem and lived with him lived at the ashram and was his successor for 15 how many years? No, almost 20 years. So that's a great resource. And yeah, I reached out to them. There's a website called Matola Reflections, which is just matolareflections.com.
I think I came across it about a year and a half ago.
Yeah, and I think when I started this research, I just sent a contact through the contact form on the website and got something back fairly immediately. And yeah, they've been of great help, and have took me at face value, this complete outsider who's never been there and never had any contact with them before. I think they're naturally quite guarded and quite wary of how he's going to be portrayed, but I think they know I'm genuinely interested and sympathetic towards him, and I'm going to do it sympathetically because he's their, he's their their Param Guru, their Gopal Da, they call him, because Ma used to call him Gopal. That was his name. She was Yashoda Ma, obviously Krishna's mum, and he was Gopal. And then Da is it's like a Bengali way of saying, like, for an elder male relative, it's like elder brother or something, Gopal Da. So
so what is it? I mean, that's it. Can you've raised an interesting point there. What is it about Sri Krishna Prem that you're attracted to? Why are you writing this biography about him?
I think I was a bit like you. I think I saw this. I think I just read the story and saw this man that could have been, if I'd have lived 100 years before, could have been me. I'm not saying I would have. I don't think I'd have had the balls to just like get up and go to India on my own and take a guru and move to the Himalaya. But the fact is, this English man who loved India and developed an interest in its philosophies and went and pursued it. I sort of, I don't know. I really identified with it. I mean, certainly it's obviously, a lot easier to do so nowadays. I mean, you can find yourself, in London, there's, 4 or 5 Gaudiya Vaishnava temples, and you can be connected with devotees very easily, and take initiation quite easily. You can take initiation from an English guru, and it's all very simple nowadays. But just the story of, when you had to really do it the hard way, and
you had to go on a pilgrimage. You had to really make the effort. You had to, austerities, tapasya. You had to do these things. It wasn't easy. Actually, I was just counting in my head, there's, I think, 7 Gaudiya Vaishnava temples in London.
Oh, there. Sorry, I knew you'd know the exact number.
And you can pretty much, I mean, obviously COVID's messed things up a bit, but you can pretty much turn up at any one of them anytime you want, and possibly even talk to a sannyasi or a leading devotee of, Gaudiya Vaishnavism. But you're right, it's very accessible now.
It's just a fantastic story. I mean, the World War One thing, the moving to India thing, founding this ashram. I mean, it's a fantastic story, which I hope will be accessible to people who aren't necessarily even that interested in Vaishnavism.
I mean, my interest is growing and strengthening, I guess, in Gaudiya Vaishnavism pre-1965. What Srila Prabhupada achieved was phenomenal. It was amazing. But I'm keen to find out what happened before that. And so this is why personalities like Swami Sadhananda Das, Sri Krishna Prem really fascinate me, because they're real people in history that have a fascinating story. I mean, when time allows, I want to spend more time looking at the 1930s in London. I've tracked down, or I've found the house which was a Hare Krishna temple in Kensington between 1933 and 1935. And the plan is, when I've got the time, I'm going to write to the people that live there. Hopefully I won't freak them out, and say, hey, do you know your house was a Hare Krishna temple? Can I come and say hello? Take some of the letters from Bhaktivedanta Saraswati Thakur, and because that just fascinates me, because also what was going on with the British Raj, it was pre-war London, pre-war Europe. Politically, the 1930s were an interesting time. Edward VIII and all that, the abdication. It's just an interesting time in history.
I think that's probably part of that appealed to me as well. I mean, I'm fascinated by the British in India, and it's a part of history that is fascinating and sort of quite underdocumented as well, I think. So it's quite interesting if comparing Krishna Prem and the Matola community to the Gaudiya Mutt. I mean, the Gaudiya Mutt almost, Bhaktivedanta Saraswati was almost pro-British, you could say, wasn't he? I mean, he invited, the governor to visit the Gaudiya Mutts, and there's that famous picture of, is it the governor of Bengal going to visit standing with Saraswati Thakur, and there's a big banner behind them that says "God Save the King," and it's like he cultivated the authorities at the time and sought the backing of officialdom, whereas I think Krishna Prem, as far as he was concerned, he was no longer an Englishman. He was an Indian. He just wanted nothing to do with the whole thing at all. So it's I think there wasn't a focus on preaching with Krishna Prem, whereas with Bhaktivedanta Saraswati Thakur, it was obviously all about growing the mission. So it's quite interesting to see those different approaches.
Yeah, I mean, my kind of neophyte understanding of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Prabhupada was that actually he was quite indifferent as to whether the British ruled India or not. He just wanted to preach. And obviously at the time, London was like the capital of the world. So he had this kind of, dream to open a temple in London, as Prabhupada did. Prabhupada, as in A.C. Bhaktivedanta Prabhupada, educated under the British, and so saw London as this kind of utopian place, materially anyway, where Krishna consciousness should be spread. I've just had a thought. We kind of, in terms of Swami Sadananda Das, who was the German convert in the 1930s, who eventually made it to India. Well, 1935 he went to India. I have a feeling, that's not a good expression to use, but I think there were probably quite a few similarities between Sri Krishna Prem and Swami Sadananda Das. Materially, and in a material sense, they were kind of abandoning or giving up their European identity, and going to India and kind of surrendering. And also Swami Sadananda Das, he was a preacher, but not on that massive grand scale. He was a bit more reclusive because he also had health problems. He'd spend a lot of time being ill, but he was quite reclusive to some extent, Swami Sadananda Das. And I think it's probably a shame that they didn't meet. They might have had quite a bit in common.
Perhaps. It's interesting because they're almost contemporaries, weren't they? I mean, obviously, Sri Krishna Prem had an easier time of it because he wasn't. Sadananda Das was interred in a prisoner of war camp and stuff, wasn't he? So I'm sure they probably didn't meet, but
it's unlikely. I mean, I'm just thinking I think there was 10 years. So Swami Sadananda appeared in 1908. So, actually, and literally, he left 10 years, 12 years after Sri Krishna Prem. So, I mean, they kind of lived a similar amount of time.
It's interesting. Sri Krishna Prem left just 2 months before A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami touched down in Boston on the Jaladuta.
Absolutely,
almost crossed over, but not quite.
Well, I have to say, John, I'm really excited about reading your book, and I think that you're doing a great service to lots of things, to the Gaudiya Vaishnava world, to Krishna consciousness, to the academic world, to have a book about Sri Krishna Prem. And it's my personal view. I think I've certainly seen over the last 5 to 6 years, Krishna conscious practitioners are becoming more open-minded about looking over the garden fence and not just looking at their own mats, and appreciating other mats, other devotees, and wanting to learn about devotees like Sri Krishna Prem. So I think your book I'm quite confident it will be well received.
I hope so. I think I was just thinking about this. Obviously, the famous book by Radhanath Maharaj, the Journey Home, where he talks about meeting all the different gurus and stuff, and that seems to have been quite well received. And I think sort of in a way that it probably wouldn't have been maybe 10 or 15 years ago. People would have been, why is he visiting all these Mayavadis? Why is he visiting all these Babas in the hills and stuff? So I think I think you're right. I think people are getting more open-minded, and I think also realizing that there is some spiritual value to other paths as well, and there isn't one way to God, and that's something Prabhupada always said. So I think you're right. I hope so.
I mean, Prabhupada said, if you're a Christian, read the Bible. If you're a Muslim, read the Quran. Everyone should do something. People should try and be God conscious if they can. Don't waste this human life on mundane activities. Just
Yeah,
try and do something, is what he
absolutely.
said.
Mhm.
Okay, John, it's been fantastic having you on the Hare Krishnas in Britain podcast this week. You've been guest
Thank you.
number 25.
Hey,
To
what an
be
honor.
to
A
be
quarter
20
century.
to be 25 again.
I hope I've done it justice. I appreciate that. There's a lot of information to take in. I feel like I've just dumped quite a lot of biographical information, but I recommend everyone look him up. Ronald Nixon, Gopal Das, Sri Krishna Prem. I mean, he's a fascinating character, and yeah, hopefully I'll get this done at some
So
point.
what is your time frame or time scale for the book?
I don't have one. It's just when I get some time, I write a little bit of it. I mean, I don't have a publisher. I don't have any deadlines to work towards. I mean, it's really a passion project that I started during lockdown. So yeah, it'll be done when it's done. I just want to do him justice. I don't want to rush it out. But
Do you know,
yeah,
I mean,
if anyone wants to get in contact with me
yeah.
and ask any questions, maybe we could just put a link under in the comments or something of my email address or my Facebook account. People could just get in touch if they want to.
I will make sure that your details are published with this podcast. I've just had, again, just kind of stalling the end. I've just had an idea. Do you know of, or are you aware of any family today, biological family today of Sri Krishna Prem?
Yes. There's one guy who I've been in contact with called Chris, who is Sri Krishna Prem's great nephew. It's his brother's grandson. Yeah, that's right, isn't it? Great nephew. Yeah, so I've been in touch with him. His mum, Krishna Prem's niece, wrote him some letters back in the day. I think when she got to her teenage years or became a young woman and realized she had sort of this, this famous, semi-famous sadhu uncle who'd gone to India and never came back, and she got in touch with him and started writing him letters. That is the only family I know of to this day.
So Sri Krishna Prem's great nephew must be at least in his 60s.
No, I'd say he's in his late 30s, early 40s.
Okay.
Yeah.
My maths are terrible, but it'd be great to, I don't know, do some, I don't mean have a book launch event with them, but just kind of to honor them as well, that this is quite quite a special thing, that one of their ancestors, close ancestors, he's had a book written about him.
Yeah, there's I think you're right, and I think there's a lot more. There's been a lot more interest in him recently that I've sort of noticed. I think leading up to the 100th anniversary of him going to India, as you talked about there, people do seem to be becoming more aware of his legacy. I know there was an article recently published in an Indian newspaper by a lecturer at Lucknow University, and they are now honouring him at Lucknow. I believe they've had a picture put on the wall and had a little ceremony and garland laying and all that sort of stuff. So he's being Professor Nixon is being recognised by his former university, although the picture is him in the lotus position as Sri Krishna Prem. And yeah, sort of online there's been more stuff popping up, and there are direct disciples as well to this day. Bill Aiken, the writer who I mentioned earlier, I think he took initiation from Madhava Ashish, but it was while Krishna Prem was alive, so it's sort of a Ritvik initiation, if you like. So I think he identifies as a disciple of Krishna Prem, and there are several Indian disciples still around as well. So he's still a direct link to him as well. So I've spoken to Bill quite a lot, and he's helped move my book, and we've done some interviews and stuff. So it's
that's phenomenal.
Yeah,
I love it.
Yeah, it's really nice being able to talk to people who either knew him or whose parents knew him, or there's lots of disciples of Ashish as well who obviously have that connection as well. So Yeah, it's good. I hope my book helps get the word out a little bit more, because as I said, it's a fantastic story. I mean, at the height of the Raj, when he went to India, he didn't obey any of the conventions of. I mean, he didn't travel in first class carriages, and he didn't associate with the governors and the civil servants and all that sort of stuff. He went, well, to use a slightly old-fashioned expression, he went native. And it caused outrage. There's a famous story which I've heard repeated a few places, and he's sitting on a train opposite an English mem sahib, and she says to him, "You're embarrassing yourself. I mean, aren't you ashamed of yourself? I mean, you've given up all this, and what have you gained?" And he has a little melody of Radha Krishna with him, and he goes, "I've got him, madam. I've got him. This is what I've gained. This is what it's all about." And it's radical. This was the 1930s. It's at a time when a lot of people, certainly the average European in India, I think, looked upon Hindus and their religion as being sort of barbaric and idol worship and all that sort of stuff. So it's a story that it's just begging to be told, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly one of the arguments or suggestions as to why Britain's first Hare Krishna movement in the 30s didn't pick up, or didn't really carry on, because it just wasn't the right time. It was pre-war Europe. People converting to an Indian religion was the last thing on people's minds, when Hitler's rising to power in Germany. So it just wasn't the right time. People saw them as heathens, these, and obviously a lot of the British Raj was about converting people to Christianity, and not about respecting people for whichever, whoever they were. Jon, it's been fantastic to have you on this week's podcast. Really appreciate it. We've been chatting for well over an hour already. It's gone all right. It's gone really quick. No, we can chat more. I don't mind. So we'll chat a bit. We'll have a debrief about the listeners and the viewers after. So thank you all for tuning in to this week's edition of the Hare Krishnas in Britain podcast. It's been great to have Jon on the show. If you're watching this on YouTube, please do put a wonderfully nice comment and like it and share it with other people. And the same if you're watching it on Facebook, please do put a comment and share it and like it, or love it, or care for it. Those three wonderful positive emotions that you can do. And if you do like these podcasts, please do follow or like the Hare Krishna Project Facebook page. We'll be having some more podcasts soon, particularly looking at some of the projects happening around the UK in the Hare Krishna movement. So thank you all for tuning in, and I'll see you all again next week. Hare Krishna.
Thanks, everyone.